and my sound. So talk to y'all later.
All right, we're seeing the first people joining the call. This talk is also live on YouTube if you're watching on YouTube. We're just going to take a few minutes to let everyone come into the call, introduce themselves. If you'd like to write up in the chat what brought you to this Vastari webinar today, what you're hoping to achieve, where you're calling in from, we'd love to hear it. Wow, so many of you are so punctual. Thank you for joining us. And yeah, please, when you are, oh yes, we are being recorded at the moment. And as you might know, this webinar will be available on the Vastari portal afterwards. If you're signing in now, we would love to hear where you're calling in from. The panelists would love to know. So please do take a minute to write up in the chat. If you select to all panelists and attendees, then the others in the chat can also get to know who you are and where you're calling in from. And yeah, we'd love to hear if there's anything specific that you're looking forward to hearing on this panel, and what type of questions you've been thinking about relating to virtual couriers and physical couriers. And we've got Washington, D.C. and Philadelphia, Virginia. Wonderful, a lot of East Coast. We've got a West Coast. So we'll be starting the actual webinar in about 2 or 3 minutes. So please do take a minute to introduce yourselves and say hello. Brilliant. We've got Paris, we've got Germany. Really wonderful to see everyone here today. Please do also feel free to share what type of things you're looking forward to hearing, what type of questions you've been thinking about. I'm sure that they'll come up as we're talking when we start the panel. Thank you so much for introducing yourselves. It's really great to see such a full house and everyone saying hi. Really brilliant. Oh, I see that some of you have been saying hello to all panelists. Please make sure that you're chatting to all panelists and attendees. Then the rest of everyone in the room can see who it is. So if you did introduce yourself to all panelists, feel free to introduce yourself again, including the attendees. Brilliant. We've got Michigan. All right. We're going to give it just 1 more minute before starting the panel. Thank you so much for all being here. If you're joining now, please take a minute to introduce yourself in the chat. Tell us where you're dialing in from. And if you have any specific questions you've been thinking about relating to the subject, our panelists would love to know. And then we'll get started soon. Quite a few familiar names and faces. Great to see everyone. All right. Still getting loads of brilliant introductions. Hello, Arizona, Malta, Germany. Really great to see you all. Canada. All right. So I think we'll start in just a moment. I can see that we've got quite a few people in the room. So I think if our panelists are happy, we'll start now. Welcome everybody for this Vastari Connects webinar. We're delighted that you're joining us today from wherever you are in the world to talk about art travels, the standards, technology, and debates in the role of art couriers. Or our working title, the question we're asking ourselves is, why does an artwork need a courier to travel with it when you have technology? And of course, this subject has become has come to the fore quite a bit over the last year because of the fact that due to the pandemic, many people couldn't travel, or there were prohibitive rules regarding quarantines, etc. So remote couriering and installation was much more popular, and technology tools have developed to assist in that. And what you could argue is then saying, well, why are we going back? There are particular benefits to using technology for this. But of course, there are also many apprehensions to using technology and benefits to using art couriers that have been used for decades. So we will talk about all of this today and explore those different drivers, and then hopefully come to a bit of a conclusion of where the industry is going in the future. The structure of this call is that we'll just have brief introductions from each of our panelists, followed by a panel discussion for about 30 minutes, and then some time for Q&A at the end. We'd love to hear from everyone in the room, given everyone's expertise. And we'll make sure to end by the end of the hour so that you can go on with your day and do whatever you're hoping to do today. So without further ado, I'd love to introduce Claire Mitchell to give us the first introduction.
Hello everyone, thanks Bernadine. Yes, so my name is Claire Mitchell and I'm the Director of Mitchell Heritage Limited. So I have collections care and management is my specialist, and I've gained this from over 20 years of working in the heritage sector. Major projects management involving decants, protecting in situ and heritage supervision is a significant part of my consultancy work. Main sort of clients that I work with at the moment are the Alphonse Mucha Foundation, the Stanley Spencer Gallery and the Palace of Westminster. I probably should say that I am based in Southampton in the UK, just to clear that one up. So you'll see that all of my clients are sort of UK based. I'm also the curator of art at Southampton City Art Gallery in Southampton, which is on a part-time basis. It's there, and also the Alphonse Mucha Foundation, that I'm responsible for the management of a very busy loans out programme. And I have acted myself as a courier for many works of art, both nationally and internationally, at different venues. And this, requires me to oversee, do the advising and acting upon the handling, transportation, condition checking and installation of the works of art under my custodian. My experiences as a courier have all been pre-pandemic, but I have dealt with both virtual and physical couriers recently. Plus, I've had to think about how we're going to deal with large-scale exhibition installations virtually. The latter is an exhibition in Taiwan for the Alphonse Mucha Foundation, which is a consignment of over 200 works of art that we're going to be lending to an exhibition. The majority of these works are very straightforward in their handling, in their condition, and also their installation requirements. But there are a number of works which are in this consignment, which do require that sort of experience and that knowledge of their careful handling and of their complex installation in particular, just due to their sort of sheer size, their sort of weight because of the glazing and also the very ornate frames that surround them. So as a foundation, we tend to send a courier to oversee the installation of these artworks. And especially because of the sheer quantity of the works as well, it kind of sort of aids that smooth installation process. And also due to the fragility and of the complex nature of some of their requirements. And also our rigid requirements to do with the environmental conditions, because a lot of the works that we lend are works on paper, so do require very sort of strict guidelines when it comes to environmental control. So having that sort of courier on site to oversee that, to make sure they're abiding by our loan conditions, is really important to us as a foundation. But due to the current situation, which is unfolding in Taiwan at the moment, the exhibition has actually recently been postponed. We've had that call now that it has been postponed just for a few weeks, just to see how it transpires there. So the collection has currently, will continue to be kept in store within a fine art facility. And upon returning the process, we will know that we won't be able to send a courier out to oversee the installation of this vast exhibition. So for us, it's going to be having to rely on that technology and to start thinking about how we are going to address some of these sort of issues, especially with the size of the work. And also trying to overcome sort of like communication barriers is always a a fine one to try and sort of prepare for, especially if you're doing it virtually, because sometimes it's easier to explain when you're actually there in front of someone as to your wishes. So we're going to have to start thinking about now how we're going to use technology to help us both, so us and the borrowing institution, to carry out that sort of risk-free installation. So yeah, that's it for me.
Thank you so much, Claire, for that introduction. And it's really helpful to hear your perspective also on the benefits of having that person traveling with the art, especially in large scale exhibitions with multiple objects. And now our next introduction is from Mackenzie Garrity from Articheck, who actually obviously is looking at it from the technological point of view. Over to you, Mackenzie.
Hi, everyone. I'm Mackenzie from Articheck. Thank you, Bernadine. And my background is kind of spans the art and the technology worlds, and it's nice to have that come together by working with software for the art world. So I think in particular, Bernadine decided to invite us today because, of course, we do have our main system, which is Articheck, which is the secure and collaborative condition database where you can create condition reports. But in particular, over the last year, we've collaborated with the art world and with sort of the different industries within the art world. We've worked with shippers and museums and galleries and conservators and framers and every other institution under the sun in order to create some new solutions for looking at art movement going forward. So the first one that came out in March was Virtual Courier. So we'll be talking, I'm sure, about Virtual Courier lowercase and Virtual Courier uppercase. So Virtual Courier uppercase is actually a project-based system that's available within Articheck. And the purpose of it is to reduce risk before, during, and after shipment. So essentially, we kind of found that, especially during the pandemic, but also looking post-pandemic and, the potential of maybe less couriers being used, or there wanting to be more supervision of shipments that didn't have couriers previously. We've put together a system where you can essentially check with video at specific points during a transit, and then that is saved in the condition record of that particular object and of the whole shipment. And then we also have the conservator and curator, which is essentially adds the ability to do video condition reporting, which is something that we found to be very interesting. And again, like Bernadine mentioned about how the pandemic has kind of opened up this conversation. In the past, we've had a couple different institutions who've said, oh, video would be interesting, video would be nice. But now that so many institutions are using video on a regular basis to communicate with each other about installations, about treatment, about all these different elements, we decided that we wanted to be able to incorporate that into kind of the condition reporting process. So that's something we've been working on as well, and is just released in May.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Mackenzie. And it's really interesting to hear how your community and ecosystem have evolved, but then as a result, your software has evolved over the past year and a half as well. So last but not least, we have John Robinette.
Hey everyone, I'm John Robinette. I'm a freelance collections manager based in New York. I have a background in primarily working with private collectors, and have traveled as a courier numerous times to really far-flung places to do really ridiculous things on behalf of these objects that we protect, and it's all really been fun. And so I've inadvertently done a weird amount of research on this. I served on the ARCS board for 3 years up until 1920, and through that, I kind of continued in some research that ARCS began at its inception in 2015, which was there was always this intention to they called it find a courier resolution, and essentially it was an acknowledgement that couriers even back then were sorely inefficient and very expensive. And so they had done a lot of research with major institutions, primarily in the United States, about ways to at least share couriers at the very least whenever possible. And then, of course, with the pandemic, things really got a little bit crazy, and we've been forced to rethink everything, even though we all seemed to acknowledge beforehand that it was a fairly unsustainable practice. And I'm also the co-host of ARCS Chat, and through ARCS Chat, we've covered the topic quite a bit because it really has been a challenging and truly one of the most disruptive things that to come up in our practice lately. So I've had a little bit of a experience with this up until this point, though I haven't been couriering through the pandemic. I'm now almost would feel guilty doing it based on what I've been researching. But that said, that's sort of my background with it, and so I'm happy to talk technology and couriers and book-in couriers, etc.
Yeah, and I think in our prep for this call, John, you mentioned something about the fact that you have a problem with the term virtual courier. Could you unpack that a little bit based on your research before?
Right. So my thought on the virtual courier term is primarily that it's not clear what we mean by that. So you could be referring to Articheck's product. You could be referring to the protocols set forth by the Art Institute of Chicago, which you can see on their website. And they have a virtual courier procedure that they use because they very early adopted a no courier policy. Or you could be talking about a virtual installation. So there's many different ways that people refer to this type of remote supervision. And so it's about clarity. And Articheck was smart to move and take command of that term, because it's really, I think it already is the way people are referring to it. So pretty soon it's going to be like saying Xerox. I'm going to go Xerox something or what have you. It's going to be that. And also, like, the other thing is, and this is no slight to Articheck, but most collections managers and registrars I know don't want to do things virtually. And I know that Articheck is not advocating for that. They're all about the book-in couriers. I'm not trying to take that away from them. But we want to promote book-in couriers so that there's always people there. We don't want to take people out of it. And I want to be clear that Articheck understands that as well. So
yeah, no, I mean, Mackenzie can discuss that now as well. So I think, Mackenzie, do you want to just talk a little bit about how you see this virtual courier with a capital V and C versus lowercase?
Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, I think that we definitely at Articheck understand. I mean, our founder is a conservator and has done many courier trips over. Annika Eriksson has done many courier trips over her career, right? So it's not that we want to take the expertise out of the picture. No way, right? It's very important to make sure that our art and cultural heritage is properly stewarded around the world. But more what we're interested in is having a conversation about, number one, if a courier doesn't have to travel with something, so if it doesn't have to be with it in transit, then can we have something else there instead of just leaving a hole, right? So I think it's important that if we say, okay, well, we're not going to have any couriers at all, we're not going to have a physical courier with that work while it's traveling between London and New York, we are going to have bookend couriers. That's fantastic. But what happens in between, right? Who's kind of keeping track of things in between? So that's something that we were kind of looking at as trying to figure out also in the long run. I think also questions of sustainability come up here, right? So, and that maybe was something was what John was referencing when he was talking about, the potential, drawbacks of physical couriering. Something that we actually looked at was this study that was done by 24-Hour Cultura out of Milan. And they actually looked at that very large Frida Kahlo exhibition that was done a couple of years ago. And they did some actual data analysis of the courier trips. And there were, I guess, 49 couriers two ways, if I'm remembering this correctly. And out of their emissions, right, we often think of like air freight or road freight being the majority of emissions for an exhibition, majority of CO2 emissions. In fact, 75% of the emissions for the entire traveling exhibition was courier travel. And so in the end, it ended up being about 110 tons of CO2, which if you give like a kind of an approximation, that's the equivalent of like over 100 football matches worth of CO2 emissions. So it's quite a lot, right? So I think if we can also kind of help to reduce that, in addition to looking at how can we, add technology in for security and safety of the works, I think it's kind of a nice combination between the two.
But I think that's really interesting, and I do think we'll dive a little bit deeper into that sustainability issue in a moment. But Claire, I was wondering from your perspective, are there apprehensions in your work with using technology? Are people a little bit apprehensive about the concept?
They are. I mean, like sort of thinking about with my Southampton City Art Gallery hat on. I mean, we try not to send a courier all the time. There's only certain sort of stipulations where, or any, sort of certain areas that we would stipulate a courier to go. It's usually because that artwork requires special handling. It has a unique or a complex installation requirement. Sometimes it's because we've not had any previous experience with that particular venue. And also if it's going to involve a complex journey for that object as well. So there's certain times when just to have that sort of physical presence of someone who can oversee different areas of that journey, of that installation process, is quite key for us. And and also for the foundation and a number of different sort of people that I've worked with. I mean, even my own sort of experiences as a courier, I've been, as John said, like, thinking about this quite a lot, is that there's been experiences that I've had myself where you just think, I needed personally to have been there. And it's usually like in the cargo warehouse when you need, you're seeing something happening over in your periphery and you have to stop like a forklift truck driver going fast and almost like, crashing into your crates. You needed to have, to be there to actually stop that from happening. There was another experience that I had in Mexico City where a flat, early hours of the morning, I've been on a plane for God knows how many hours. And then a flatbed truck turns up to escort, to take your painting to the venue. Being on there to actually physically stop that from happening, it was vital to actually have that person there to do that. And then also just sort of reacting to a work of art that suffered a slight sort of impact with the transit of it. So one of the paintings that I was curing had some dislodging of debris from the frame, which got lodged between the canvas surface and the glazing. So actually sort of agreeing and given permission for that to be deglazed, deframed, and overseeing that and actually helping out because of the complexity of that. It's something, that I needed to have been there to do. So there's always going to be sort of apprehensions reflecting back on past experiences that I've had. And I think to sort of being familiar with those works of art, knowing what could potentially happen and whether it could be alleviated from using technology, whether it is just, having sort of images sort of shot you on each leg of that journey, or whether it is something that we do deem the necessity of having someone physically there. And I think it is just that, to me, I've just been thinking about it. It seems to be the times when, the transport company, the art shippers, we pretty much trust them implicitly. The borrowing venue, if you're happy with their facilities report, you're happy with all of their security report, and you've lent to them before, then you've got no sort of real significant worries with them. Sometimes it is those little pinch points, whether it's at the cargo warehouse, whether it's at the airport, those sort of areas there where just having that physical presence goes a very long way.
So I know that both Mackenzie and John have responses to these comments because this is the crux of the situation. So Mackenzie, you were about to say something, I think.
Yeah, sure. So I think that, there definitely can be cases where something needs a physical courier with it, no matter what, right? Doesn't matter if you have technology available or not. And I think that's why kind of having technology be flexible is really important. So that's something that, we've focused on is essentially, can we create a project system where you could have an actual physical courier using it, or have the shipper use it, or have a bookend courier use it, or have the borrower use it, right? So that way, in that case, you can kind of, the institution who's lending can always make the decision of who they want to have there in person, but the documentation is still there. Because I think, definitely what Claire was saying, for example, with, if something gets damaged in transit and you need to deglaze it and deframe it, it would be great to be able to document that for insurance, for example, right?
So, and just thinking about technologically, kind of a bit of the risks around it. So you're using this video technology to record these things. Is there not a security risk to using your camera that way?
That's a good question. So if you're using Zoom or WhatsApp, 100% yes. So if you're using any sort of video streaming software, or sending pictures via email or via WhatsApp or any of those types of systems, then you are much more open to security risk, right? So it both can be on the end of the fact that it's not password protected and you don't have sort of customized spaces to be working in that are very closed systems. So because of that, anyone can kind of find something and access it in many cases. The other thing though, and I think we know, everyone in this webinar probably knows this, human error in many cases is our biggest security risk, right? So I think when we're working in sort of more personal spaces like WhatsApp in particular, which has become very, very popular to do sort of virtual courier activities, it's very easy to sort of forward on a video to someone, and say, oh, look what I'm working on right now. Isn't this cool? Because it's sort of, that's what you're used to doing in that type of space. But of course, that immediately is a big security breach, right? Which you may not be sort of thinking about at the time. So that's something, another thing that we've really focused on is to make sure that the system where we're working in for virtual courier is very closed. It's two-factor authentication. And essentially, it's a legally verifiable audit trail, right? So if you send something via WhatsApp, you have the timestamp on there, that's fine. But in order to actually have sort of the full amount of data that's required to make something legally verifiable, you need to have a signature there. It's also best to have a location, right? We actually have GPS coordinates. And it's best to also include, essentially every piece of data that you can that can be saved within a record that can then be reviewed by another institution or by your insurer or by your broker, et cetera.
So John, I know that you've been looking a lot at bookend couriers and potentially using people on the ground that are not traveling with the art, but actually taking over almost like a relay race. How does that work? Is that also risky, or do tell?
Well, I actually believe that it in some ways can provide better supervision for your objects. And let me explain. So typically a booking courier is someone that's a hired third party that you assign to supervise at the airport, ride on that truck, and realize the work of the courier all the way from the condition report to the installation. The benefit of that, a lot of people, major institutions are trusting the borrowing institution. So for example, they're allowing the borrowing institution to do the installation and the condition reporting, but there is sort of an incentive. We could argue how strong that incentive is, but to not report everything. And, there's a lot of trust involved in both operations, whether it's bookend or a trusted partnership with another institution. But with a third party, their interests are aligned with the people that hire them, right? They're looking to protect the works. So you hire someone for the supervision, but you can actually specialize. You can hire specialists. And this is the thing that I get excited about most, is that you could hire a registrar to, and this is, I'm not the first person to say this. I've had other people from other major institutions talk about this. You can hire a registrar to do that airport supervision or to ride on that truck. You can hire an object-specific conservator to oversee whether it's time-based media, painting, paper, what have you, photography, and do a more detailed condition report than what I say as a registrar could do. And then you can hire, if necessary, a specialized art handler to do that installation or supervise that installation, whichever might be the case. So in some ways, it actually provides more advantages. In addition, you have someone that say knows the airport, they know the language, they know the protocols, they know what to expect in that place. So that's a major advantage. Of course, to Claire's point earlier, so much it truly depends on the object. And when you have really, say, fragile or specific pieces that require specific needs, then it's a different story. But I'm involved with the For the Love of Art webinar series that goes on, and it's primarily a group of shippers. And I sort of unofficially surveyed the shippers, which are from Asia, Europe, Latin America, United States, about the percentages of works that they ship that are two-dimensional works that just hang on a wall. And depending on the country, depending on the time of year, et cetera, but they're talking about percentages from 60 to 90% of works that get shipped are two-dimensional works that get hung on two hooks, right? So it's no real expertise that's required, or nothing extra is required for these things. Okay, yeah, say it's $100 million, it's still a painting. So,
Well,
you're
okay.
gonna have yeah. Go
I
ahead.
just wanted to touch on a debate that happens there. I mean,
Sure.
being a registrar and a courier is the livelihood of people. Is this going to be the Uberization of this industry, in the fact that it becomes a gig economy, people don't have fixed jobs, that you start kind of taking away from that expertise that is currently within the sector?
I mean, in a way, it's already going there. What it does is that it takes away the travel aspect. And again, this is not for everything. Just say 50% of those courier trips go away, because you realize that A, there's already a courier going on that. B, that other courier has taken, say, a courier training course that we all agree on, say the UK Registrar Group 1 that was developed with the Nordic and the Dutch registrars, standardizing the expectations, right? And then, but when it does come to those specialized things, it becomes a gig economy. It's just that it's localized, it's regional. I mean, I get hired by shippers to do condition reports or to oversee things because they're in New York, and right now there's a travel restriction or what have you. They don't want to travel. There's a quarantine. So yes,
Yeah.
it's still the livelihood. I mean, I used to do a lot of courier trips for people, and okay, it's actually helped me a lot to not have to spend a week or 2 weeks away, just because of family and stuff. But also it's just not necessary.
I think Claire, you're clearly working with a lot of organizations where there are you are a gig worker to a certain extent with Mitchell Heritage. Is this, as John says, a trend that is already happening, and this is just the way that the industry is going?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, again, just sort of like working for a local authority. So at Southampton, there's not many people who work for the gallery and within collections. I'm only on a part-time basis, and I would form the courier pool, shall we say, to sort of go on these trips and oversee these installations. We have one conservator who again is part-time. She's only 2.5 days a week as well. So again, as soon as we go out for 2, 3, maybe 5 days to oversee an installation, that's a week gone from our time in the museum. And so that's a huge loss for us. So sometimes, not even being able to go and to do these courier trips because, you've got other responsibilities back at the ranch, back in the office, which is kind of, sometimes more important. So we would look to either share couriers, especially if there's others going from the UK, to actually share that courier and sort of handing over that responsibility. But then at that point, it's just making sure that they're fully briefed with our own sort of condition reports, our own sort of requirements when it comes for installation. And, like we said, is, sort of giving that responsibility either over to someone else who's couriering their own sort of works, or whether you actually give that to a borrower. I mean, just today we've got an exhibition that's being installed in Brittany for the Alphonse Mucha Foundation. And we've had a couple of phone calls today just inquiring about wall brackets, because some of the paintings are extremely heavy. And And because, again, it's that sort of communication, you know, as I mentioned earlier, that sort of communication barrier where some, you know, if we were there on the ground, sort of easy description, or even just sort of showing them there and then, we could get it sorted in no time. But, you know, that sort of toing and froing today of, you know, trying to sort of detail, you know, what we're looking for was quite difficult. But then now that's prompting us to really up our game when it comes to doing really sort of detailed condition reports, installation guidelines, images of exactly what, you know, when we're sort of thinking about these complex installations, exactly what we're requiring. And I think that's going to be us sort of going forward in a lot of the institutions that I deal with.
Makes sense. Mackenzie, what were you going to say?
Oh, yeah. So I was just going to drop in and say, so the Frida Kahlo exhibition that I was referencing before, the total cost of those Courier trips was $800,000, right? Or euro. So almost $1 million in total costs. So I think that, you know, like John and Claire talking about it, you know, about the potential of sort of this shift into more of a gig economy, I think it goes two ways a little bit for book and couriers. And this is what we've seen as well for sort of the early shipments that we have going for virtual courier already, is that what tends to happen is kind of one of two ways, right? Either something in the past could have had a physical courier the entire way, and instead they're going to use bookend couriers now. But I think that in some cases, you're going in the other direction where something wouldn't have used a courier because they wouldn't want to pay for, you know, the business class tickets, but they would use a bookend courier now because it's just sort of one of those cases that's right on the edge between doesn't need a physical courier or not, right? So I think that the sort of, if there were a true market of bookend couriers all around the world, like, you know, in terms of communication, things like that, it definitely makes things easier, right? But also it does open up the possibilities for a lot of maybe small to medium-sized institutions to have courier-like personnel in place when they couldn't send someone previously.
Can I make one quick point? I mean, Mackenzie's exactly right. Look, what's going to happen is, and I didn't come up with this. John Simmons, who is the oracle of collections management, and has written some great books. You know, his point is that more and collections are going to just get bigger, and they're going to be staffed by fewer and fewer people, right? And so, what we've seen this last year is that there have been a lot of layoffs, not primarily by collections care staff, but some. There's a lot of available people, is my point, to do this freelance work, and the budgets have been slashed, and so the reality is that people have already made moves towards reducing this, and in order to, collections don't get smaller, right? They only get larger, and so we're going to need more people to staff this, and it just makes sense that we distribute those folks around the world. And I think that if we just brace for it now, I think it becomes a lot easier. And plus, like in the United States, of course, hiring someone to be additional staff means you also have to pay benefits, things like this. It's very expensive. So it's a lot easier to just pay someone for a few hours or a few days of work to do condition reports as opposed to paying for staff, sending them on a business class flight to pay for a minimum of 2 or 3 nights in a hotel plus per diem. It just gets it gets to the point where it just makes sense. So
this reminds me, Bernardine, of the webinar you came on for Art Evolve. So we also have a webinar series called Art Evolve at Articheck. And Bernardine joined us to talk about local exhibition economies, right? So this kind of makes me think about that a little bit, in the sense of maybe the only thing that's not local is just the transit of the work, but then all of the rest of the economy for that exhibition can be local, right? So I think kind of that hybrid approach is very interesting.
And let's move on. Actually, that's a great transition into talking about the sustainability issue. I mean, Mackenzie, you've already alluded to it with the study for the Frida Kahlo exhibition, but in general, clearly, there is a lot of, there are huge carbon emissions for these exhibitions, and people argue, why does art need this special treatment, etc.? Is it worth the carbon? Is it true that this is less that this helps with the carbon emissions issue, and that institutions are really, due to the pandemic, changing their thought process around this, that this is really, so that they're doing this not only because of the cost and because of the complications of the quarantine, but actually because of the carbon footprint. Claire, would you like to maybe comment from your perspective?
Yeah, I was going to say, because I mean, like, it's very much like for the accreditation process now, you know, environmental policies are coming into the forefront, and so it is definitely very much on our minds of doing everything that's going to have like that impact on the environment. And I think, you know, sort of when you're thinking about loans and that carbon footprint, you know, it's a bit of a no-brainer. You know, if we're going to have to, you know, we're you know, saving money, but also, you know, that is the way to do it. And like you say, just having, it's very true what Mackenzie said, you know, that the only thing that really does need to travel is the works of art. And if we can really support it in a way by either submitting detailed handling guidelines, just really sort of talking through that process, then there's no real reason as to why you would need a physical person for that installation. But, you know, there's still that little worry where you're going to have those pinch points. But, you know, I think it's going to be very difficult to alleviate those sort of moments. So yeah, so I think, yeah, something else just popped into my head, but it's gone completely out. So I may come back to you in a minute.
No, it makes sense. And I think that I've heard of exhibitions starting to think about their carbon footprint and trying to reduce it in order to attract sponsorship, in order to attract more interest in what you were talking about, environmental concerns. Definitely there is something there. But is it short-sightedness? Is it short-sighted to kind of look at the carbon footprint, but then lose irreplaceable works of art? I'm trying to be devil's advocate here.
Well, I think it needs to be a balance, right? With everything. I mean, there are going to be works of art that are always, I mean, I don't think, for example, you know, we would never have Michelangelo's David or the Mona Lisa travel without a courier, you know? I mean, come on. There are going to be certain, you know, probably the top 1% of works of art are always going to travel with a courier. I don't think that's a question. But I think because we're going to have so many more people involved in these moves for the, you know, bottom 99% of works, and then you're also going to have, you know, the physical couriers involved, and then, you know, we have all these different institutions involved. If we can kind of take all of that information and keep it somewhere that's safe and permanent, I think that's kind of part of what we're talking about, instead of getting fragmented by having all these different solutions available to us, which are all wonderful, but creates more complication in the end because we can't actually keep track of everything, right? I think that's really important. Something that we need to consider is, you know, we want to be able to keep track of everything ideally.
Yeah, I have to say though, the image of someone couriering Michelangelo's David around the world did really. It's a fun thought.
Can I say that I mean, that's a critical point. Look, the safest thing to do for our collections is to not travel them, period, right? So aside from doing that, which none of us are really going to do, and that kind of shortchanges the entire world and their ability to access, you know, for whatever reason, you know, these objects. The next phase of this is to redesign how we lend in around the idea of whether it's sustainability, cost, efficiency, all of the above, really. And so that our practices aren't just adapting to the pandemic, but we've just evolved our practices so that they are simply better, right? And, you know, if we just take as a baseline, okay, well, our policy is first, try not to send a courier. And if we have to send a courier, can we send a book-in courier? And if that's not acceptable, then we look at sending our own staff. And of course, context is everything. The type of institution you're lending to, the staff availability, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that's, I mean, I don't think that anybody really wants to get rid of people. It's just about, you know, deploying them in a way that makes the most sense given the context of the transportation and the loan. So
I think the other thing to keep in mind too is, and we've mostly been speaking about museums, right? Museum loans or private collection loans up till now, but the gallery world is very interested in sustainability. There's like the, you know, Gallery Climate Coalition and other sort of organizations that have formed over the last year and a half. And I think, for us originally, when we created Virtual Courier, we had air freight and road freight, because those are the two primary ones that are used for exhibitions. And very shortly after, we added sea freight, because all of these galleries were saying, well, actually, when we send things to art fairs, as long as it's not something above a certain value, we're not going to fly it, right? We're going to send it via the ocean. But the problem with that currently is that sending things via ocean, they cannot be insured because of the number of touch points that there are on the ocean. But the thing is sending something via sea freight is much more sustainable than sending it via air freight. So I think if we can also look at technology as a way to put into place some of the controls that would allow us to open up more options, to allow for more sustainable travel, that's not just considering, are we sending a courier or not, right? If it's something that would never travel with a courier, but could it travel via sea freight? If it were insured, how can we get it insured? And that's actually something we're looking at right now. So I can't say too much more, but we're excited about it.
Great to be thinking about innovation in that way. Claire?
And just sort of picking up at that point about the insurers as well, because that was something that we had to just sort of look into as part of the Alfons Mucker, because not sending a courier, whether that was going to have any effect on our insurance at that time. But it's not something that they sort of worry about. Again, it's that expertise, having the expertise on site to undertake the art installation, to undertake that condition assessment of those works. As long as you've got that sort of expertise within that team which is on site, it doesn't sort of do anything within your insurance policy or sort of even raise your premium if you're not actually having anyone from the foundation. So for that, that kind of sort of really sort of, alleviated any of our worries at that point, because it is something that sometimes just sort of plays on your mind. Not having anyone from your own institution there, is that going to affect? But
yeah, and moving to the questions in the chat, there was one question about other benefits that come from couriering. So beyond just protecting the work, it also helps with networking, with sharing expertise, with other types of circumstantial things, that water cooler effect that happens when you courier. Is that a huge shame to be losing that?
I mean, us as an institution at Southampton, we've made many networking connections with fellow couriers, fellow institutions, whether that sort of results in research into our paintings, also sort of getting information to do with certain materials that an artist has used, and also into conservation work as well. The best way to proceed with, especially like frame conservation, becomes like a hot topic sometimes with some of our very ornate frames. So I think to actually lose that network for institutions would be would be very detrimental.
Do you think you could have the same type of a relationship over video?
I'm not sure. I don't know. You would think so, but I just think, sometimes, whether it is at that particular time or when it's you're sharing the evening, sometimes when you go out with fellow couriers, you start talking about sort of different things and, things come out from that. So it'd be very interesting. But I think, like you say, the networking sort of process of that is quite a key sort of moment within courier trips.
John, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I know. I mean, I think there's no doubt for a lot of people that it's a major loss, but it also kind of depends on the person and the personality. I mean, look, I personally have benefited from those relationships, but I'm also an extroverted person. There's plenty of people I know that they leave the gallery at the end of the day, they have dinner and they go back to the hotel, and they're not necessarily networking. So it kind of just depends, and that's their choice. That's not any circumstance. And a lot of times, those of you who have done courier trips know that you're not necessarily hanging out with the museum staff after. Yeah, you can talk shop during the day, but they go back to their families and their lives after work. And so it's not always that, but I mean, again, like I'm someone that has personally benefited from it. So, but I think that you can probably get 60% of it on video chat, and hopefully, with conferences and things like that. And again, you can kind of supplement it, but I don't know. I just think that the benefits of the other kind of outweigh it. It's unfortunate because I'm such a social person. I like it, but I also recognize that it comes at a cost. So
yeah, and if you do have if you do believe in the goals of combating climate change, and that this is really an existential threat to humanity, then perhaps those issues are like outweigh, as you were saying, sometimes the benefits outweigh each other. Claire, were you going to say something? Oh no, okay, just nodding.
Completely agree.
So another question from the chat was actually about whether we should rethink all traveling exhibits in light of this amount of CO2 generated, mainly that you also foster through the tourism of people visiting blockbuster or large scale exhibitions, kind of extremist. And I think we've already kind of acknowledged that there's a balance to be had, but do we think that people's attitudes towards traveling exhibitions is going to change, that they're going to come to exhibitions thinking, gosh, was it worth touring this here? Mackenzie?
So I hope so, a little bit, and I'll tell you why, right? I love touring exhibitions just as much as, any other art nerd out there. But I think the other thing to look at that is that, about 90% of any museum's collection is then most of its life kept in storage, right? Which does a couple things. Number one is that it doesn't get to be seen, which is unfortunate, because although they may not be the best known pieces, they may be very interesting in their own right, for the public's education. But the other piece of it is that also that means that those pieces get less funding, right? And I think probably a lot of conservators can speak to this, or museum staff, that if something is kept in the back room and it's never seen, not only does the public not see it, but donors don't see it. And so then it's not deemed something that's, worthy of the funding in order to be conserved, and it may fall into disrepair. And I think that happens, unfortunately, more often than not, right? So I think it's not that traveling exhibitions should go away entirely. I think certainly we want to be able to share, cross-culturally our cultural heritage, but to be able to show more of what's in a museum's collection, I think would be really valuable, in fact.
I think that another way to conceive it, we need to reconceive how we organize our traveling exhibitions. So right now, I'm going to repeat what I kind of said at the Art Switch conference, which is there's essentially kind of three models in my mind of traveling exhibition. And right now we primarily operate in a centralized model, which means that we base everything in one institution and its affiliated facilities, right? We send it away to a loan and then it comes back. So it's based around one point. And then I think that the next phase, and this is sort of what a long-term traveling exhibition does, but it could be more efficient, is more of like, think of it as a loop, or like a train line, where it's planned more, it's taken logistics more into consideration, right? So if we think of it, it's as one stop along the train line, as opposed to now it goes to London, now it goes to Mexico, now it goes to Asia, now it comes back to London, and these sorts of erratic schedules, which are highly inefficient and costly. Another way to do it is, what if we think about if most of our collections are in storage, what if we relocate them to a different storage facility and base loans out of that facility, so we can make them accessible to a different region, but not have such long trajectories in
so
venues.
if you have a museum in New York, that their facility would be in Mexico, is that what you're suggesting?
For example, so take for example, say an institution in New York wants to make their works more accessible to Latin America. Okay, so what if you base it in Mexico City? Make a collection of objects, make 100 objects available in storage in Mexico City, so that the trajectories aren't as long and they're easier to get to throughout the rest of the Latin American region. I've certainly been involved with exhibitions that didn't want to pay for transit and crating for New York to Brazil, for example. That's a huge flight, and for oversized works. The other option is an exhibition copy, which shouldn't be ruled out if you can work it out with the artist. And then finally, another wild radical thought is, what if you only sent objects one way? What if you send it and then stored it near to the borrowing institution when it's done, and then it just leaves from there. And look, that's highly, I mean, there's so many things wrong with that.
That is
idea.
properly decentralized. If we
Yeah,
start sharing collections to the point that other institutions are storing them for you,
well,
that's radical.
I mean, I was thinking about storage facilities nearby, but either way, I mean, you could also just call these things long-term loans, right? And just ship out more of your collection and make it more available. So anyway, my whole point in saying all of these things is just that maybe we just need to look at our practices differently, as opposed to just trying to fit, staffing in a new way over the same policies.
Completely understood. And I think that really is food for thought for everyone who's thinking about it. Claire, were you about to say something?
Yeah, I was just, well, I mean, like some of that kind of fills me with dread, sort of as a custodian of a permanent collection. Sometimes, especially with travelling exhibitions, we're hindered at Southampton to accept sort of travelling exhibitions just because, they are quite expensive for a local authority gallery. So we tend to steer quite clear of them. But then for us to sort of share our own collection is one way just to get that out there, so new audience to see it is so important as a permanent sort of permanent collection, to actually get it out there for people to enjoy. And whether that's being through like loans to other institutions, or I mean, something else that we've started to focus on a lot more is that our sort of virtual, our sort of online presence, which the pandemic has actually helped us to focus on. It's not something that we've ever had time to do before. So the pandemic has actually pretty much forced us into, so doing our social media, looking at Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and really sort of pushing that, allowing people to access our collection a lot more. So that's been a real sort of positive. And which has been quite sort of inspiring, but trying to sort of then govern that with working at the same time has been quite problematic in itself. So it's getting that balance right of sort of that online presence, but also getting the actual works out there. And as Mackenzie says, the last thing we want is our collection to be kept in store. That or sort of object rotation is such a key thing for any sort of institution out there.
So Mackenzie, were you going to say something about that?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I was just going to toss in that I think something that has, come out a lot more in the last year in terms of technology is the ability to see exhibitions remotely, right? So not just the online presence, but also actual, virtual reality spaces and things like that, where you can see things remotely. And I don't think we're 100% there yet, right? Most museums don't have access to that technology yet. It's getting there. I think it's getting a lot better. But, if we could essentially allow for that to be another space where everything can be shared globally, and in addition to that, potentially even be another revenue source for museums, I think that would be something really to strive for in the long term.
Gosh, you're really saying something that we've been thinking about so much over the last year of Astari, because we're even thinking about having the option when you look at an object for loan to be able to ask, do you want to borrow the physical object or a virtual version? And then you could show that virtual version either in a virtual reality exhibition or a space, or as an augmented reality piece that actually shows up as a hologram within the exhibition itself. And maybe just asking yourself about which one is more, is it really necessary given all of the circumstances for that physical object to be there? But that's straying from our original thought. We've been thinking about this a lot. So I think we're coming up to the end of this talk. Incredibly, it's really flown by. And just before closing, I wanted to ask you a little bit about what is inspiring you right now in terms of your role, Virtual Couriers, and the whole conversation that we've had today. So who would like to start with a kind of closing inspiration for our listeners? Claire?
Yep, I'll go first. I suppose mine's a little bit off-piste because I kind of sort of took it down, sort of things that I've been working on recently. But I've been working quite sort of heavily with institutions changing their collecting policies. So sort of, working towards updating their policies to reflect sort of different needs and significant gaps within their collections, whether that be to focus on more works by female artists, LGBTQ, ethnic minorities, that sort of thing. But then sort of flipping that into how it's going to affect sort of like in the couriering side of it. It depends, the size of these works, the fragility, the importance of actually sort of being able to, look after these works going forward. Luckily, it's not something that we need to think about within that sort of collecting policy at the moment. But when you start thinking about it with your couriering hat on, it's quite an interesting debate that you have in your internal monologue when you're sort of writing these collecting policies.
Yeah, and I don't think it had to have to do with couriering, but it does relate to what John was saying about these collections are going to keep growing, right, and there are going to be less and less people taking care of them, or well, proportionately less people taking care of them. So it's really important to be thinking about this. But thank you for sharing that. That is one of the inspiring things that's happening at the moment, and great to hear that you're seeing it in your work. John, do you want to go next?
Sure. I mean, honestly, my thoughts these days kind of centralize around this topic quite a bit. And so it is pretty much, on topic, and it's not an outside thing. But my thought process about collections care kind of originates in the idea of how blockchain works. And so this notion of decentralization and distribution of care is really just an explanation of what blockchain is, right? And so and how it functions. And so that's for me the way I think. And so, in my own practice, I've tried to employ those techniques. And so in a way, personally, I'm shifting what I do from being the person to that handles and does all of the sort of collections management work, to being the person that coordinates it, so that it makes possible all of these things that we're talking about today. So and then more so. So that to me is where my thoughts are at the moment.
Really interesting, because clearly museums have been at the center of centralization of knowledge, and with open policies, etc. It's trying to open that up. But you're right, in terms of academic expertise and subject matter expertise, there still is a very centralized approach. So really interesting to take that technological side into inspiring the way you're thinking about your own job. That's really cool. Mackenzie, what's inspiring you right now?
Sure. So with the launch of Virtual Curator, which is the video add-on to Articheck, I actually got to do this really interesting video case study with ePark, which is based out of Belgium. They also have offices in London. And I was super inspired by what they were doing, because essentially they were just our alpha guinea pigs for this product, right? So I was just kind of anticipating to hear their thoughts, and it was gonna be a nice chat. But what ended up happening was they said that from the point that we gave them the video software, they had used it on multiple projects to be able to share treatment progress and not have their clients come into the studio ever again at all, which was fascinating to me. It was like an entire shift in their process that they were able to do in a period of like a few months. It was really inspiring to kind of see their verve for innovation. And then the fact that they were using it in ways that I had never even thought of. So they have this really cool time lapse that they did of the installation of the work, which was like an enormous painting, 3.5 by 2 meters, that had to be installed in a town hall. And they did this sort of very interesting time lapse that both was, what I really enjoyed about it was the fact that they were centering the conservators in the process. So it was no longer just, here, look at the work, look how much we've improved it, but it was actually saying, look at the people who are important to this process. Let's center them in this discussion too, which I think is so important, especially, as we kind of lose funding in museums. So I thought that was pretty inspiring.
That's really inspiring, also given the debate we've been having about the gigization of expertise, and feeling like maybe you're less supported by the institutions. Someone in the chat mentioned the open letter generation that we're in terms of museums. And so having that value of the expertise and spotlighting it using technology, that's really, really interesting. Thank you so much for sharing, guys. We've just passed the hour. Really appreciate everyone staying to hear the full thing. And thank you John, Claire, Mackenzie. This has been wonderful. We covered so much ground, and I'm sure we could have kept talking for a very long time. For everyone who's on the call, this will be available on the Vastari portal, and we'll be sending you a link hopefully in the next 24 hours. Thank you for joining us. I hope you found it interesting, and Yeah, see you soon.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Really great.